Good morning, students. Today, in lecture number 12, we are going to conclude Wordsworth's concept of poetic diction and concept of poetry. Dear students, in the previous lectures, we have discussed in detail the concept of poetic diction by William Wordsworth and concept of poetry by Wordsworth. In both the units or in both the concepts, we have very well understood, came to conclusion that the very purpose, the very object, very intention of William Wordsworth behind the selection of language, the language of poor, illiterate, rustic people is appreciable and noteworthy. Because being a poet and minute social observer, William Wordsworth thinks that, expects that every class in the society should be the subject of poetry or the very language which they may speak and use. But what happened? He observed that since long, since the creation of poetry, since long, the poets have been using the only language of the high class people, the people aristocratic one. So he, for the first time, expects his object in his preface to the lyrical ballad, written along with S.T. Coleridge in the edition of 1798. Just I am concluding both the concepts, and today we will finish this section. And in the next lecture, lecture number 13, we will move to F.R. Lewis' concept of business criticism. So just today we will highlight the main points between the two concepts. So in the preface to lyrical ballad in the first edition of 1798, the very object that William Wordsworth expresses, puts in front of the contemporary poets, and his object is to choose the language of lower and middle class people in the society, the very language which they use. And we have to just use that language of lower and middle class men by just adding little color of imagination, means just by making a filtration. But instead making a discourse, interaction over this subject, the neoclassical predecessors means purvas, the earlier poets, the contemporaries of William Wordsworth, who have been writing, selecting the very language of high class people, have mercilessly attacked, means bitterly attacked. Instead, listening to him, thinking on his object, they have mercilessly attacked on his issue, on his expression, on his purpose. So, by such attack, by such refusal, by such oppose for his selection, William Wordsworth, the very primary object, he makes the principal object, and in the preface to lyrical ballads, second edition, which was published in 1800, he has decided to choose the language of lower and middle class of society, because he is a very general object become the principal object after the attacked, and here he has decided in his principal object, decided in the second edition to choose the incidents and situations from common life. Yes, common life is from the life of common men, the incident and situations from the common life, and to relate or describe them, means to relate and describe them throughout as far as possible, throughout as far as possible in a selection of language used by men, and the same time to throw a light, to throw a color of imagination over them, then the ordinary things will be presented in an unusual way. So the very object become the principal object, and William Wordsworth has decided firmly to choose the incidents and situations from the common life of men, to relate and describe them throughout as far as possible by throwing color of imagination over them. Then what will happen? The ordinary things will be presented in an unusual way. Means the very lower and middle class unusual, means that usual becomes unusual, means the extraordinary, and none could have presented before such selection of language for poetry. So he becomes a trendsetter, pioneer in this field, in this selection of the lower and middle class life, by choosing the everything in from their life, incident, situation, relay, description throughout as far as possible, means he has decided to take everything. And this way what happened, when one has asked why the only common and lower man as the subject or as the language for the subject of poetry, and he explains that only low and rustic life was chosen for this purpose. When he was explaining why only rustic life, low and rustic life of people is chosen as a subject, at that time he explains that, he says, in that condition, means the lower and rustic people's language, life, incident, situations throughout, when we choose, he says, in that condition, free from all outside influences, because the very language of these men, the men of lower and rustic, is free from all outside influence, means men speak from their own heart, and they don't have any imitation influence of other people, because they represent what they have originally, really. So men speak from their own and away from outside influences, and convey their feelings and notions in simple and more permanent way. Men speak from their own heart and convey their feelings and notions, we can say, in a very permanent way, and so that the very language of these lower and middle class of men, according to William Wordsworth, is must be a subject of poetry, because this is away from any influence. Men speak from their own heart, and the very convey their feelings, notions in a permanent and a real way. So, the very concept of poetic diction, in which second object, principal object, William Wordsworth had decided to choose the very language of these high class men, and instead of high class men, he has decided to choose the language of such. And he further says, as a poet and as a trendsetter, William Wordsworth further says that, what he said, when he explains his purpose after the object, principal object, he says, was to imitate, means his purpose means, my purpose was to imitate, and as far as possible, to adopt the very language of men, and assuredly such personification do not make any natural or regular part of the language. Means he explains his purpose also to choose the very language of this man, And throughout, it means that beside the very selection of language of this lower and middle rustic people, incident and situations from their life, he also decides to choose the traditional ways, styles which are also required for the poetry. So he has decided beside the subject of language of lower and middle class men, he has also decided to choose phrases, rhyme with meter, figure of speech, and periphrasis, inversion, antithesis, the figure of speech which the poets have been using since long. So he doesn't want to remove that method or traditional method which has been going on like father to son, so he want to follow it. But the subject selection of language, he was firm to choose the language of lower and middle class. And further, Wordsworth again says that he is only recommending, means what he says, he is only recommending a selection of the language really spoken by men, and feelings will itself from a distinction of greater than would at first imagine, means a very selection of this language about which he was firm. He said such feelings are never used or first imagined ever before, he says. And again he was repeats the very language, selection, incident, situations from the life of common man. He further says the very language of man which was Wordsworth's original object. What was the original object of William Wordsworth's concept of poetic diction? The very language of man which was Wordsworth's original object, and that condition lies only in matter but also in the choice of words and phrases. Means he was very firm with the very language whom Johnson calls the flowers of speech, because the very language, the language of this lower and middle class men, incident situations from their life, to or for Wordsworth seems very pure, away from any outside influence, and such language which seems definitely a flowery language, and such selection of language nobody has ever imagined. And so he was firm with his idea. And he says further that his poems, like we have Tintern Abbey, Solitary Reaper, Immortality Ode, Daffodils, each and every poetry is full with such represent of nature, language of lower and middle class men, and the very concept that father to son means phrases, rhymes, rhythm, antithesis, inversion, and periphrases he uses as a trend. So, no doubt Wordsworth poetry of which is a good part of Wordsworth poetry of incident and situations from common, we chooses incident and situations from common life of lower and rustic men, lower and middle class men. He says the incident and situations from the life of men that succeed nobly, means finally the very experiment, the very concept of poetic diction finally becomes successful, and finally everybody has accepted it, though by the poet shall make the primary opposition, but it became noble, proved noble, and everybody has accepted it. And the very advertisement of 1798 of Preface to Lyrical Ballad, the very object become the concept of poetic diction. So, William Wordsworth is considered as a pioneer, trendsetter of such selection of language which he chooses as the subject of poetry. And after this concept of poetic diction, yes, I will highlight on the concept of poetry. Dear students, we have seen that concept of poetic diction and concept of poetry very well highlights the In the concept of the poetic diction, we have seen how William Wordsworth had chosen the language, what part he had chosen, and how finally it proved as a noble one. And so after that, in the concept of poetry, we see how the poetry begins. Means, as the very outset, William Wordsworth in concept of poetry defines the very definition of poetry, and he says poetry is a spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings and emotions recollected in tranquility. Hence, poetry, according to William Wordsworth, is a spontaneous overflow of what? Of powerful feelings. Spontaneously arise powerful feelings. Spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. This one section, and second, the emotions recollected in tranquility. Both the things are different from each other, and though they have no relation with each other, but when the poetry forms, we see that the outburst of feelings or spontaneous feelings of powerful feelings spontaneously occurs, and the same feelings the poet mixes with the record, keeping record memory in his mind, and the same relevance incident he matches with the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings which record material in his mind, and then poetry becomes. Though they are different, but they correlated in the poetry, because such tranquility means whatever is stored in his mind, he matches with the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings, then the poetry came into exist, though they are different from each other. Because finally he says, poetry is the final product of such unforced powerful feelings or overflow of powerful feelings, overflow of powerful feelings. And secondary, he says, such interpretation that is to opposite statement can be reconciled. Means such powerful feelings and tranquility, emotions, recollection come together, which the poet has recollected in his mind, stored in his mind by his walking, traveling, running. Whatever he sees, he catches in his mind, stored in his mind, and the same matches with the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings, and both the reconcile. Then the poetry came to exist. And the very first process of poetry is, just I told you, the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings, and the next is recollection in tranquility. Spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings, and recollection means stored memories in recollection in tranquility, and the last, the poetry means explanation of these both makes one. The poetry means then it becomes an expression of poetry. After this, we see that he has also considered and talked about the function of poetry. He talks about after this. Then he talks about, after the function of truth, function of poetry, he talks about poetry is the pursuit of truth. Poetry is the pursuit of truth. And the last, which we have seen yesterday, poetry is a great force for good. Poetry is a great force for good. So these are some things, some issues the poets use, because according to him, though he says further, the function of poetry that he talks about, and it means that the function of poetry means only sheer self-expression of spontaneous overflow might suggest. spontaneous workflow might suggest. And after that, he talks about the pursuit of truth, that poetry is known as a pursuit of truth, and he says, of man's knowledge himself and around him. Man's knowledge of himself and the world around him, he says, it gives the truth. And finally, he compares the poetry with science, though science gives man materialistic, independent things, but science is harmful because it harms to the mankind. Man harms to the man, while poetry gives pleasure, happiness, and we can say the satisfaction which science doesn't give. And he further says, poetry is a great force for good, and it means that, means finally he says, poetry is a great force for good, and it means that it gives, according to him, poetry gives consolation to the afflicted, those who are depressed, and at that depression, in that depression, if they read poetry, it consoles to their mind, means poetry consoles to the afflicted. And he further says, it gives sunshine to daylight, means if one is leading a darker life, tragic life, it gives sunshine and also daylight, and removes the darkness from his heart and mind. So poetry is a great force for good. It consoles the afflicted, gives sunshine to daylight, and further says, makes happy, more happier, and feel, and therefore become more active and stable, virtuous. Makes happy, more happier, so it makes more virtuous one. So he says the poetry is a great force for good, and it gives happiness, support to the needy and required one. So this way, the concept of poetry of William Wordsworth, after concept of poetic diction, is a great force for good. It is a pursuit of truth, and it, in its function, talks about the sheer self-expression. So poetry, according to William Wordsworth, is a good force for human being. It makes man happy. It makes the happy happier. It consoles the afflicted, and it is no doubt more permanent, more moral. It gives more moral. It gives much philosophy, and it is no doubt poetry is a permanent one, and makes mankind happy and also noble one. So with this, I stop here. In the next lecture, lecture number 13, we will go to FRVs. So thank you very much.